Hello and welcome to Room to Read presents Reading as a Critical Life Skill, partnered by ET Now. In the wake of the coronavirus outbreak, education has been hit particularly hard, with countrywide school closures in upwards of 200 nations. And the quality of a digital education has been called into question, down to the development of the most fundamental of literacy skills. And that, of course, includes the ability to read. So what's the solution? And as we collectively migrate towards this new normal, how can we ensure that our country's children keep reading? Well, it's a complex question and it deserves to be approached from a 360-degree perspective. And fortunately, I'm joined by a highly distinguished panel of subject matter experts to help me do just that. We have with us best-selling author, Gurcharan Das, faculty member, Azim Premji University, Dr. Shailaja Menon, Program Director, Room to Read, Shakti Brata Singh. And joining us in just a few moments will be journalist, columnist, and author, Jag Suraya. Thank you so much for joining us. And Mr. Das, I'd love to kick off this conversation with you. What's your view on the extent to which reading or mastering the written word can equip individuals with the skills to cope with life's challenges?
My favorite definition of happiness is to love the person you live with and to love the work you do. And both of these, I'm convinced, come from good reading. And I make a distinction between making a life and making a living. I remember as a child, I was four years old, and I came home with a report card to my mother, and I was here was a prize. And she said, "Did you stand first?" And this is quite what some mothers would have asked. But what she should have asked is, "What did you read today? And did you enjoy it? And tell me the story of what you read." And so as we went through school and college, at that time, we were told to take safe subjects in college so you could max and then get a good job. And then when we reached somewhere in our 40s, and suddenly you felt that you had wasted your life because you had basically been pursuing making a living. Avoid this midlife crisis and learn from the experience of others. And the best way to learn from the experience of others, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, just read books.
Mr. Sen, I'd love to bring you into the conversation here, building on a few of the points that Mr. Das has made. Now, we're of course migrating towards a digital education model, wherein school children of all ages now have immediate access to the internet. And with that comes a huge influx of information. So has reading via a digital medium impacted the depth of the reading process, the comprehension and critical thinking aspects to this very fundamental literacy skill?
As far as digital reading bringing to us, an avalanche of information from various corners, I mean, that's the truth. Whoever is dealing with even a smartphone, and trying to read several things onto the screen, there is a plethora of things that people are reading all the time. And a most noted cognitive neuroscientist, Dr. Marianne Wolf, has started to raise this question very, very strongly, that whether the definition of reading in the digital culture is getting, unfortunately, confined to just skimming. All that we know about a word and all that we know about a world, to that written text, we need that pause, we need that poise to be able to think while we are reading. This is the culture of reading, which is going to save reading in the way it should be saved as a human endeavor. This is what probably Gurcharanji is talking about, making a life.
And Dr. Menon, the Honorable Prime Minister Modi has, of course, with his National Education Policy 2020, placed heavy emphasis on the fact that children need to learn to read in order to read to learn. What do you make of that policy, and what does the data indicate in terms of, adolescents that are perhaps not fluent readers, how it typically impacts their adulthood?
Well, it's wonderful that we have a national education policy that sort of emphasizes foundational literacy. But at the same time, what Shakti Prata as well as Gurcharan Das ji have been emphasizing, we need to have a clear conception of what we mean and a more expanded vision for these kind of policies. Otherwise, the danger is that they can be reduced very quickly into very mechanical, very meaningless set of programs of action where we think that our job is to just equip children to sort of decode the script. And what Gurcharan Das ji has been sort of emphasizing the difference between making a living and making a life. Another way that you can put it is the instrumental purposes of language or literacy versus the humanistic and transformative aspects of language and literacy. And we need to make sure that the larger, the more expanded aspects of language and literacy sort of are deeply reflected in any programs of action that we come up with. Let me get to your question about the adolescents. The problem is that, and again, to sort of elaborate on what Shakti Brata said, when he talked about the word and the world, this idea comes from Paulo Freire, who's like a very noted Brazilian educator, who said, reading the world precedes reading the word. So the word has to sort of flow out of people's worlds. And when we read the word, it has to permit us to reimagine our worlds. So there's a dynamic relationship between the world and the word, such that the word flows from the world and the world is reimagined through and via the word. So the power of the word, literacy per se is nothing. Its transformative effect comes if there is a dynamic living relationship established between the word and the world. And it is only then that, the adolescence and the impact on adulthood and all that we are talking about and societal transformation as well can happen if there is this kind of a living dynamic relationship that is firmly established in the minds of the learners.
Now, Mr. Suraya, Dr. Menon has made a fantastic point about establishing the dynamic relationship between the word and the world. But how is that best executed in the current environment we find ourselves in now? And what role do both teachers and parents, perhaps jointly, need to play?
Obviously, what distinguishes us from the animal kingdom, we are animals, but what distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom is language. Whales, I'm told, can communicate with each other through sound. The story of human civilization was actually born when a written script was invented, because then you no longer had to depend only on an oral tradition which could be passed on, and it would be like Chinese whispers, the game of Chinese whispers. As you pass it on, you pass a message on, it gets distorted. So with a script, you could actually record and communicate with people over years, over centuries. You could pass down this knowledge. I remember years ago in Newsweek magazine, there was my favorite columnist, I think his name was George Will. He wrote this column in which he said that he didn't have any children. He said if, in fact, he did have a child, he would like to teach that child, or not teach that child, try to inculcate in that child two things. One was logic, and the other was sympathy. Logic you need to communicate with other human beings, because that is the basis of our humanity, that we are able to communicate. But logic by itself was not enough. In order to want to exercise that choice, we had to feel sympathy for the other person, for other people. So he took these two things, he said logic and sympathy. And I thought for once he was being prolix, he was using too many words. Because those two things, logic and sympathy, can be summed up in one word, and that is language. Language has to be based on some logic. And because it is there, anyone who reads, anyone who writes, only does so in order to get in touch with someone else whose thoughts, feelings might be quite different from ours. So I think the very basis of anything that we call civilization is the ability to read and to write and to communicate. So with this sort of digital, eruption tsunami that we are being swept away with, one thing strikes me that today it is not just what we read which is important. We have to be very, very fastidious, very choosy about what we choose not to read, because there's a whole lot of misinformation, deliberate disinformation, and sheer propaganda being put out by various elements who actually take language and they totally distort its meaning. They take it out of context. I do fear that for various ideological and propagandist ends, our very language, our very source of being able to communicate with each other, the very source of our humanity, of our civilization, uh, is sought to be undermined by the corruption, by the debasement of language. So this is something which we have to be very careful of. And the other thing is that in this process of being able to choose what we should be reading or what ought to be read and what ought to be ignored, I think we must make this distinction between literacy, the ability to read something or to write something, and education.
Mr. Sain, if I could bring you in now, I think good reading habits need to be inculcated early on. So the argument that, reading will help you make informed life decisions down the road perhaps doesn't immediately resonate with a child or an adolescent. So how best can we encourage them, incentivize them, and, essentially help their interest in reading bloom from an early age?
Reading is a culture. It's a cultural artifact, it's a cultural endeavor that we all have to inculcate in ourselves. And we do it ourselves first, and then we can think of our children. I mean, and of course, even in schools, we are, since time immemorial, a land of stories. We have had, in oral tradition, we have transmitted life's biggest lessons through stories. Yet, why does a teacher, the moment she enters school, keeps that aside and starts teaching something else? Just being literate is not enough. We have to be educated. What I would want to say is that the definition, the contours of the word literacy needs to be expanded. And that is just where we really need to start very, very early with our children. Even if, I mean, the general notion I've heard, I mean, government school teachers or even parents, that we would give books to a child after she learns to read. I mean, why that? Give them books right from day one. Let them grow up with books. They need to see people reading books. They need to see people deeply engaged with books. And we need to have a culture where we deeply engage with books with children. It's only then we will be able to create the difference, the culture that we are all talking about.
Mr. Das, when it comes to creating this reading culture, what do you perceive as some of the more formidable bottlenecks, if you will, that are specific to the Indian landscape?
Let me quickly take off from what Jug Suraya said about the great moment in human history when script was found or created, invented. And it's sobering to realize that for 99% of our tenure as human beings, as Homo sapiens, we did not have books, we could not read, we did not have a script. So it's only in the last 1% of our life on earth. So let's not lose that time.
Phenomenal.
And I mean, books give us superhuman powers. They work like magic. So I'll come to your question and answer. What this has been one of the best education policies ever, this latest one that's come up. One of the things that's good about it is it's getting away from rote learning. So actually, we would have been much better not going to school at all for the last 60, 70 years, rather than going through to school. And the old way of teaching is what Shakti just talked about, is telling stories. India is the oldest storytelling culture in the world. And a lot of our stories were taken by the Arabs and went to Europe as Aesop's fables and so on. So really, whether it was the Panchatantra, Hitopadesha, Katha Saritsagara, we have this compendium of stories. And that's really educating through stories is you can begin it even before the child learns an alphabet by just telling stories.
And I love Dr. Menon's points on how about their ability to concentrate and their ability to process information. How is that impacted? And volumes of information, the ability to concentrate.
Yes. What I'm saying, a lot of people say that digital reading is so overwhelming that it's superficial and shallow, and many of us have experienced it in, WhatsApp messages coming and all of that. But it turns out that digital reading actually is a far more complex act, and that's why we human beings are failing at it, and that's why it is so shallow and superficial. It's a far more complex act than reading a book, because when we read digitally, we have hypertext, we are hyperlinked to other sources. So instead of understanding the one source, we are constantly asked to integrate, synthesize from multiple sources using multiple media. There is video clips, there's audio clips, there is textual material, and this is overwhelming for our brains. And then we are asked to make critical decisions about, is this, what is the sourcing? Is it, valid? Should we believe in this source, etc.? This is overwhelming for the human brain, it turns out, and we are not particularly experienced at managing this overwhelmingly complex task of digital reading. Because we are unsuccessful at it, we haven't yet figured out as a species, which biological mechanisms to piggyback on to succeed at this new task that has been thrown at us. That is why perhaps we are reading shallowly, superficially, skimming, because it's too intense a task for the human brain as such.
And I'll take the conversation to you, Mr. Sen. Now, a lot of analysts are saying that there are going to be new deficits in the learning process as a result of this global health crisis and new age education models. And in fact, many experts claim that, the most poverty-stricken students, the most marginalized students are going to be continuously at the greatest disadvantage. And COVID-19 may perhaps only build this urban-rural divide rather than bridge it. What are your thoughts as to how that pertains to foundational literacy levels in our country going forward?
Well, that is something which we are encountering and we will encounter more in the future. But the question is, what is the solution? Let's think of solutions first. And I think the solution is to bring together all sorts of online and offline resources to that last child in that particular village of India, so that we can start minimizing the gaps that you're talking about. So it has to be, the new normal is not only to be driven by data from the digital divide. The new normal, which is a combination of online and offline, also has to be strongly propelled with all the wisdom that Gurcharan and Jug are talking about. Look at the deeper engagement with the text. Look at the deeper engagement with the word and the world that we were talking about. If this culture needs to be instilled in every child of India, we will really need to think of various kinds of resources for them. We have to take all of those resources to them, to that last corner of India. To you.
All right, and by way of closing comments, and I pose this question to the entire panel, Dr. Menon, I'll start with you. What sort of reading culture and daily reading habits are going to go on to define our success as a nation and improve the quality of life for generations to come?
But in terms of the reading culture, the reading habits, My favorite thing to say to my students is that we cannot eat pizzas and ask our children to eat palak. If we want our children to be readers, if we want our society to be readers, I would like the parents and the teachers to raise their hands. Are they readers? Do they read and engage with a wide variety of texts for a wide variety of purposes? We are not talking about reading only as reading fiction or reading whatever else that we have been talking about. Good readers read a wide range and a wide variety of texts for different purposes in their lives. Are we modeling that for children? Is one question I would ask. The second question is, before our children can read, storytelling has been talked about. Are we reading out to children? Because in addition to storytelling, something that adults can do is to read books aloud, keeping the book in front of the child, which signals to the child that there's something worthwhile in the book to discover and things. So if we are, as adults, are able to model these couple of things, perhaps we would have a greater reading culture.
I think our reading culture will depend a lot on our conversation culture. What do we talk to with our children? Do we just sit like couch potatoes in front of the TV and watch whatever is happening, or do we as parents? I mean, I'm not a parent. I mean, I don't have any children, but do we, as a family, do we engage in conversation and an exchange of views? Because where do our views come from? They come from other conversations, but they come from a conversation called reading. The reading of newspapers, the reading of periodicals, the reading of books, of course, certainly, and a variety of books, covering a wide range of subjects, non-fiction as well as fiction, history, biographies. And the more we read and the more diverse our reading is, the more diverse our conversation with our peer group, with our family, with our peer group, with our colleagues at work, and with society at large, in wherever we have interaction, the more diverse it will be. And I think this is what we need to celebrate the diversity that is our country, and without which I don't think India would be India at all.
Well, we have this knee-jerk reaction against digital stuff. It's your attention span gets shorter and all this kind of things. And actually, one should look at the positive side also. And the other thing is, I talked about the 100 Great Books, the Great Books program. And and what is wonderful about it is that all these 100 books are available free on the net. Anyone with a little hunger, anyone with a good teacher, anyone with a good parent can start his own education at any point in time because of that. So, we call this, it's supposed to be called the knowledge age. And I think to some extent it is, because it has democratized knowledge. You can see, for example, things like Khan Academy and what Khan Academy has done to children's sort of quantitative, numerical skills. Absolute amazing. And I was giving you the example of Hello English, and how in 2.5 months, this little girl was speaking fluent English, thanks to this game that she was playing. Digital revolution is the information revolution. Now, the information revolution needs to be translated into a revolution of wisdom. That's very different. Information is very different from wisdom.
We are facing a revolution of information that's being posed to us. And we know that it's complex, and probably we as a human race, we still need to learn the complexities of how to read digitally. Rather, how do we tackle all of these lateral linkages of information while we are reading something? But I've always felt that the central, I would say virtue, the central habit or the central discipline needs to be my own discerning power of whatever I am reading. If reading culture is to be scaled up, this message of discerning, critical, ethical reading also needs to be scaled up. Thank you.
Well, I have to thank all of our panelists for sharing such a rich range of anecdotes from their personal and their professional journeys. It's been very inspiring. And with that, our special feature, Room to Read presents Reading as a Critical Life Skill, partnered by ET Now, comes to a close. Thanks for tuning in.